In the summer of 1883, beneath the glittering chandeliers of Newport's mansions, a young woman's fate was sealed. Her family, ruined by debt, sold her to the most feared magnate of the Gilded Age, a man whispered about in every parlour, a widower haunted by shadows and secrets. What began as a cold bargain soon became a battle between pride and passion, trust and betrayal. Could love truly be born in a union forged from desperation? Or would the sins of the past shatter them forever? Tell me, where are you listening to this story from? And do you believe a marriage of duty can ever become a marriage of love? Newport, Rhode Island, in the summer of 1883. The Atlantic winds carried the scent of salt and the faint music of distant waves crashing against the rocky shore. Beyond the horizon, the great mansions of Bellevue Avenue rose like marble palaces, symbols of an age gilded by fortune but darkened by ambition. In such a world, reputations could be shattered overnight, and families once powerful could find themselves ruined by a single reckless decision. Lydia Montrose stood at the tall windows of her mother's drawing room, her delicate hands pressed against the cool glass, her gaze fixed on the avenue below. She was only 22, yet her face was shadowed by the weight of decisions not her own. The Montrose family, once spoken of with admiration at society luncheons, now whispered about in tones of pity and contempt, had fallen into disgrace. Her father's speculations in railroads had collapsed, leaving them drowning in debts that no amount of refinement or carefully measured smiles could conceal. Her mother, elegant still despite the years of sorrow etched around her eyes, moved across the room in a gown of faded silk. She carried herself with the composure of a woman determined to hold together the fragments of her world, even if it meant sacrificing the dearest possession of her heart, her daughter's future. "Lydia," she whispered, her voice both tender and unyielding, "there is no choice left to us. Victor Caldwell has agreed. Tomorrow you will become his wife." The name fell between them like a sentence. Victor Caldwell, widower, steel magnate, a man nearly twice Lydia's age. His fortune was as immense as his reputation was fearsome. In Wall Street he was called Ruthless. In Newport he was deemed untouchable. People bowed before his presence, yet whispered behind closed doors of how he had built his empire on crushed rivals and unrelenting ambition. Lydia turned from the window, her grey-blue eyes shimmering with a storm she could not restrain. "Mother," she said, her voice trembling, "they say he has no heart, that he looks at people as if they were nothing more than iron to be bent and broken. How can you expect me to stand beside him as a wife?" Her mother's lips pressed into a firm line, but her hands trembled as she clasped them together. "Because, child, if you do not, we will lose everything. The house, the last of our respectability, even the very name we bear. Do you think society will forgive us otherwise? You will be condemned not as Victor's wife, but as the daughter of a ruined man." Lydia's heart constricted. She longed to protest, to shout her refusal, but her words withered before they left her tongue. She knew her mother spoke the truth. The Montrose name, once gilded, now trembled on the edge of disgrace. And she, Lydia, was to be the price of redemption. The evening stretched on in suffocating silence. Candles burned low, casting shadows across the high ceiling. Lydia sat by the piano, her fingers brushing absent notes over the ivory keys, yet no music rose to soothe her restless spirit. She imagined herself in Victor Caldwell's house, trapped beneath his unreadable gaze, her laughter silenced, her youth sacrificed. The thought brought a flush to her cheeks, not of warmth, but of anguish. When the dawn finally broke, the house was alive with the sound of hurried footsteps. A carriage waited outside, polished black, its brass fittings gleaming in the pale morning sun. Lydia, dressed in a gown of ivory satin trimmed with delicate lace, descended the staircase with the grace of one walking toward destiny rather than choice. Her veil, embroidered by her mother's weary hands, trembled with each uncertain step she took. The streets of Newport, lined with sprawling summer palaces of the nation's wealthiest families, seemed to watch her as the carriage rolled past. Behind lace curtains and gilded balconies, whispers surely rose, "There goes Lydia Montrose, bartered to the Steel King." She sat motionless, her hands folded tightly over her lap, the weight of the city's judgment pressing upon her shoulders. As the carriage approached the avenue where Victor Caldwell's mansion stood, the sight struck her with both awe and dread. His cottage, as society mockingly called it, was no mere summer home, but a fortress of wealth and ambition, its marble facade gleaming beneath the sun, its towers rising with the arrogance of a man who bent the world to his will. The horses slowed, hooves striking against the stone driveway, and the gates, iron wrought with the precision of his own steel mills, swung open. Lydia's breath caught in her throat. The sound of the hinges echoed in her heart, like the sealing of a fate. She pressed her gloved fingers to the carriage window once more, gazing upon the mansion that was to become her prison or her salvation. Her eyes closed for a moment, and a single tear escaped beneath her lashes. The carriage rolled forward, crossing the threshold into Victor Caldwell's domain, and with it Lydia felt the last fragments of her former life slipping away. The bargain was sealed. The heavy iron gates had closed behind the carriage, and with them the last fragments of Lydia Montrose's freedom. The wheels clattered over the marble-paved drive, leading her toward the mansion that society, in a cruel jest, called a cottage. Rising above gardens, manicured with military precision, the residence seemed less a home than a monument to its owner's will. White stone gleamed in the late afternoon light, and every window glittered like a cold eye, watching her approach. When the carriage finally halted before the grand entrance, a row of liveried servants stood in rigid silence, as though rehearsed for a royal pageant. Footmen in dark coats trimmed with silver buttons bowed deeply. A butler of solemn bearing opened the carriage door with a motion so precise it seemed almost mechanical. Lydia hesitated, her gloved hand hovering before she allowed herself to be helped down. The marble steps rose before her, leading to immense doors of carved mahogany adorned with iron scrollwork. Crossing that threshold felt like surrendering to captivity. Her ivory gown rustled with each step, its satin hem catching the fading sunlight, making her appear to her own mind less a bride and more a prisoner clad in ceremonial attire. Inside, the mansion's air was cool and heavy, with the scent of polished wood and roses arranged in crystal vases taller than a child. Chandeliers dripping with crystal pendants cast fractured rainbows across the marble floors. Paintings of stern ancestors and European landscapes lined the walls, their gilded frames reflecting the flickering light of 100 candles. Lydia's breath faltered. It was a palace, and yet it felt unbearably cold. Voices drifted from beyond the hall, low and expectant. The wedding reception had already gathered its audience, and with it the judgment of Newport's unforgiving society. Lydia's heart hammered against her ribs as the butler guided her toward the ballroom doors, which opened with ceremonious weight to reveal a scene of dazzling splendor. The ballroom blazed with light. High ceilings glittered with chandeliers, and the walls were draped with silk in shades of gold and crimson. Ladies in gowns of satin and velvet clustered like jeweled birds, their fans fluttering in patterns as intricate as their whispers. Gentlemen in black frock coats and gleaming boots stood in groups, their eyes sharp with curiosity. The air was filled with the strains of a string quartet, yet the music seemed fragile against the stronger notes of gossip that rippled across the room. All eyes turned upon her. Lydia felt the heat of their scrutiny, the weight of their disdain thinly veiled behind polite smiles. She was the daughter of a fallen family, bartered to a magnate whose power was feared as much as it was envied. In their eyes, she was not a bride, but a transaction. A lady's whisper, though hushed, cut through the air as if shouted, "Poor creature, traded like cattle to the Steel King." Another voice, laced with malice, followed. "He could have chosen anyone. Why her?" Perhaps he delights in reminding us that even ruins can be purchased. Lydia's cheeks burned. Her steps slowed, yet she forced her chin upward, summoning what remained of her dignity. She remembered her mother's words. Appearances were everything in this world. To falter now would be to invite ruin upon ruin. Victor Caldwell stood near the head of the room, his tall frame commanding attention. Dressed in a black coat tailored to perfection, his silver watch chain gleamed against his waistcoat. His hair, touched with grey at the temples, gave him an air of authority rather than age. His expression was as unreadable as stone, his dark eyes fixed upon Lydia with neither warmth nor cruelty, only a piercing intensity that unsettled her. He extended his arm. The room hushed as Lydia placed her trembling hand upon it, the weight of his presence both reassuring and suffocating. Together they advanced through the throng, society parting before them like water before a prow. Yet in the silence that followed their steps, the whispers resumed, quieter, sharper, like blades drawn in secret. The reception unfolded with all the grandeur expected of Newport's elite. Servants glided among the guests carrying trays of champagne in crystal flutes. The scent of roses mixed with the aroma of roasted pheasant and spiced pastries. The string quartet played waltzes that stirred memories of Vienna and Paris, yet Lydia felt no music in her soul. She moved like an ornament displayed in a gallery, every smile rehearsed, every word measured. Ladies approached with courtesy sharp as needles. "My dear Mrs. Caldwell," they said, voices honeyed, yet eyes gleaming with amusement. "How fortunate you are!" Their compliments dripped with poison, and their laughter followed her when they turned away. Lydia answered with soft words and lowered lashes, hiding the storm of humiliation within her. Victor, for his part, remained composed. He spoke sparingly, his baritone voice low and controlled, offering nothing for others to seize. He introduced Lydia with formality, his hand firm upon hers, yet his gaze gave her no clue of his thoughts. She searched for warmth, for reassurance, for any hint of tenderness, but found only a wall of restraint. As the evening wore on, Lydia felt the walls of the ballroom closing upon her. The glittering chandeliers seemed to mock her, their brilliance amplifying the shadows of doubt. She longed for air, for escape, yet duty bound her to remain. Her glass of champagne trembled in her hand, though she did not drink. Every movement, every glance was watched. At one point, a gentleman leaned close to his companion, his words not meant for Lydia's ears, yet reaching them nonetheless. "The Steel King buys everything he desires. Tonight, it is a bride." The words struck her with the force of a blow. She turned her head, but Victor had already caught the remark, his jaw tightening for an instant before his composure returned. He gave no sign of anger, no defense of her honor, only silence. Lydia's heart sank. Hours passed like centuries. One dance followed another, yet Victor did not ask her to step onto the floor. He conversed with his business associates, his hand occasionally brushing hers as if by duty, never by desire. Lydia's mind drifted to what awaited when the music faded, when the guests departed, when only she and Victor would remain within the echoing halls of this palace. The thought filled her with dread and trembling curiosity. Would he be the ruthless tyrant society painted him to be, or the silent protector her mother insisted upon? She could not know. His eyes, when they fell upon her, revealed nothing. They were like polished obsidian, reflecting all, betraying nothing. When at last the final guest departed, leaving behind the faint scent of perfume and candle smoke, Lydia stood alone at the foot of the grand staircase. The silence of the house pressed upon her, heavy and suffocating. The servants retreated into shadow, leaving her in the vastness of the marble hall. Victor approached, his steps measured, his presence filling the emptiness. He offered no words of comfort, no gesture of reassurance. Only his gaze, dark and steady, met hers. Lydia's breath faltered, her pulse racing beneath her corset. The air between them vibrated with tension, an unspoken promise, a fear, a secret she could not yet comprehend. She lowered her eyes, her hands clasped tightly before her. The echo of society's whispers clung to her ears, ornament, bargain, purchased, yet within her heart another whisper rose, one of uncertainty, of anticipation, of the unknown that awaited beyond the doors of the chamber upstairs. The mansion loomed around her, gilded and magnificent, yet it felt to Lydia like a prison, wrought not of iron, but of duty and silence, and within its walls her fate waited, unreadable as the man who now stood at her side. The echoes of the reception still lingered in Lydia's ears, long after the last carriage had departed. The music, the laughter, and the whispered cruelties of Newport society clung to her like a shadow, refusing to disperse even as silence claimed the mansion. She stood at the foot of the staircase, her gloved hands trembling against the folds of her gown, while the candles guttered in their sconces, casting restless flickers across the marble floor. Victor Caldwell's figure loomed nearby, tall and dark against the opulence of his own creation. He had not spoken much that evening, and now, as the servants melted into obscurity, his silence seemed heavier than the grandeur around them. Lydia's heart pounded with fear. The moment she had dreaded since the betrothal was upon her. The moment when appearances would fall away, when she would face the man whom society called ruthless, a man she now called husband. "Come," he said at last, his voice low and measured, carrying a command that brooked no resistance. Lydia's steps echoed faintly as she followed him up the sweeping staircase. Each step seemed to carry her deeper into a labyrinth from which there would be no escape. The air grew quieter, denser, as they reached the upper corridors, where portraits of solemn ancestors gazed down with eyes painted centuries before. She felt judged by their silent stares, condemned by a lineage that was not her own. Victor opened the doors to a private chamber. It was vast, panelled in dark mahogany, with velvet draperies of midnight blue pulled against the night. A fire burned in the hearth, its glow softening the severity of the room, yet doing nothing to ease the weight pressing upon Lydia's chest. The massive four-poster bed stood in shadow, its carved posts reaching like sentinels toward the ceiling. She hesitated at the threshold. Her breath came shallow, her fingers twisting together. She expected coldness, cruelty, the claim of a man who had purchased her future. Every whispered tale she had heard filled her mind, that Victor was merciless in business, incapable of tenderness, and that his first wife had not survived long in his world of steel and stone. Victor closed the doors with deliberate care, then turned toward her. His gaze, dark and unreadable, fixed upon her trembling form. For a moment, he said nothing, only watched her as if weighing her spirit against some invisible measure. Lydia lowered her eyes, heat rising in her cheeks. She could not endure the piercing silence. "I know why I am here," she whispered, her voice so faint it barely reached him. "I do not ask for kindness, only do what you must, and I will endure." A shadow flickered across Victor's face, surprise, perhaps even pain, but it vanished as swiftly as it came. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming, and Lydia's breath faltered. Yet instead of seizing her with the roughness she feared, he spoke, his tone heavy with something she could not name. "You think I married you to take what was mine by right," he said. "You think I am the monster society has painted for you." Lydia dared a glance upward. His eyes caught hers, and she felt a jolt run through her, an intensity not of cruelty, but of torment, a storm restrained within dark depths. "I did not want another wife," Victor continued, his words deliberate, each syllable weighted with gravity. "When I buried my first, I swore there would never be a second. The grave closed over not only her body, but the part of me that believed in companionship, in trust. I intended to live alone, untouched by society's judgments. But your family's ruin would have destroyed more than your name. It would have dragged mine into the filth of scandal I could not permit." Lydia's lips parted, confusion mingling with disbelief. She struggled to comprehend his meaning. Then, "Why me?" she breathed. Victor turned away, his hands clasped tightly behind his back as he paced before the fire. The flames cast restless shadows upon his face, illuminating lines etched by grief and years of burden. "Because your disgrace became convenient to mine. Because by marrying you, I silenced questions that would have been raised again about her, about my first wife." The mention of that name, unspoken, of the figure who haunted his life, struck Lydia like a cold wind. She had heard whispers at the reception, rumors laced with venom, but never from Victor's own lips. She waited, breath suspended, for what more he might reveal. "She died tragically," Victor said, his voice rougher now, as though dragged across stone. Society called it an accident. Some said it was despair, others betrayal, but none knew the truth of what passed within these walls, and none will know, not even you. He stopped, turning back to her with eyes that burned, not with hatred, but with the anguish of a man pursued by ghosts. Lydia pressed a hand to her throat, her pulse racing. The air seemed to thin, her fear shifting into something she had not anticipated. Bewilderment. This man, so feared and despised, did not stand before her as a tyrant eager to claim possession. He stood as one wounded, a soul encased in armor of steel, yet still bleeding beneath. Her voice trembled, fragile yet steady. "You married me to protect your name, not because you desired a wife." Victor inclined his head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement. "Yes, desire has little place in this arrangement. What I have given you is my name, my wealth, my protection. In return, you will give me silence and obedience. That is all I ask." The words cut deep, yet they carried no cruelty, only resignation. Lydia's breath shuddered in her chest. She had braced herself for domination, for humiliation. Instead, she found herself facing a confession that unsettled her more than the fear of his touch. He was not a monster, but a man carrying scars so deep that he believed affection itself to be impossible. For a moment, silence stretched between them, fragile as glass. Lydia lifted her eyes again, her gaze meeting his with newfound boldness. She saw the tightening of his jaw, the flicker in his eyes, as though he struggled against something he could not allow himself to feel. "I understand," she whispered, though her heart did not. "I will not bring shame to you." Victor's shoulders eased, just slightly, as if her words offered him a balm he dared not accept openly. He turned once more to the fire, his face cast in shadow. "You may rest here tonight," he said quietly, his tone softened yet firm. "No harm will come to you. Whatever you may think of me, I am not a man who forces what is unwilling. Sleep, Lydia. Tomorrow society will demand your smile again." Lydia stood frozen, her heart torn between relief and confusion. She had entered the chamber expecting cruelty, yet instead she had encountered a confession heavy with grief and sacrifice. The man she had feared as merciless had revealed himself to be something far more dangerous to her spirit, wounded, enigmatic, and capable of stirring within her a compassion she had not expected to feel. As Victor moved toward his desk, opening a ledger with deliberate motions, Lydia sank onto a velvet chair near the fire. The warmth of the flames touched her face, but it did nothing to soothe the storm in her heart. She watched him in silence, a figure cloaked in both authority and sorrow, and realized that the prison she had entered was not built only of marble and steel. It was built of secrets, of scars, of a man whose confession had left her breathless with questions she dared not yet voice. The night stretched long, filled with unspoken words and the faint crackle of the fire. Lydia's fear had not vanished, but it had changed. Where terror once dwelled, now lingered the haunting pull of curiosity, of compassion, and of an enigma that bound her fate to his in ways she could not yet comprehend. Morning broke over Newport with the brilliance of a gilded dawn, the sunlight spilling across the endless lawns and glittering against the marble facades of Bellevue Avenue's palaces. Lydia Caldwell, though newlywed, felt more like an intruder than a bride in this world of excess. The day after Victor's startling confession had left her restless, her thoughts torn between relief and uncertainty. He had spared her from the cruelty she feared, yet his words, cloaked in resignation and shadow, still echoed in her mind. Now, society awaited her. No longer Lydia Montrose, daughter of a fallen family, she bore the name of Caldwell, a name spoken with both reverence and unease. It was her duty to step into the circle of Newport's most powerful women, to endure their scrutiny, their barbed pleasantries, their whispered judgments. The butler entered her chamber that morning with a silver tray bearing a note of invitation, embossed with a crest she did not yet recognize. "Mrs. Langley requests your company for luncheon," the butler announced. His tone betrayed nothing, but Lydia's heart contracted. She had heard the name murmured at her wedding reception, Mrs. Beatrice Langley, widow of a shipping magnate, a woman whose beauty had not dimmed with age, and whose ambition was spoken of in wary tones. Clad in a gown of pale lavender silk, trimmed with ivory lace, Lydia descended the grand staircase. The fashion of the year, 1883, demanded a narrow waist and a bustle that gave her silhouette dramatic shape. Her gloves were of white kid, her hat adorned with a single plume, modest yet dignified. She moved with grace, but within her trembled the knowledge that every gesture, every word would be judged mercilessly. The carriage conveyed her through streets where mansions rose like marble dreams, until it halted before a villa of Italian design. Beatrice Langley's home was as formidable as its mistress. Servants ushered Lydia into a salon adorned with heavy draperies, gilt mirrors, and the faint perfume of roses. Beatrice awaited her. She was near 40, yet her beauty remained sharp, like a blade that had been carefully polished. Her gown of deep emerald velvet clung to her figure with deliberate elegance, and her dark hair was swept high beneath a jeweled comb. Her smile was courteous, her eyes merciless. "My dear Mrs. Caldwell," she said, her tone rich with irony. "How kind of you to accept so swiftly. Newport society is eager to become better acquainted with you." Lydia curtsied, her cheeks faintly flushed. "The honor is mine, Mrs. Langley." They were not alone. Several ladies of society gathered in the salon, their gowns shimmering in hues of sapphire, rose, and gold. Fans fluttered, glances darted, whispers rose and fell like the hum of bees. Lydia sensed the unity among them, not of friendship, but of shared curiosity. She was the spectacle of the day, the young wife of Victor Caldwell, the man who had eluded Beatrice Langley's grasp. The luncheon unfolded with elegance, yet beneath its polished surface lurked malice. The table was set with porcelain from France, silver cutlery engraved with crests, and crystal glasses that caught the light in 1,000 fragments. Dishes of oysters, cold pheasant, and delicate pastries appeared in sequence, carried by silent servants. Beatrice presided with practiced charm. "Tell us, Mrs. Caldwell," she began, her voice silk draped over steel. "What do you think of Newport society? It must be quite different from the circles you knew before." Lydia's hands tightened around her napkin. She knew the trap within the question. Her family's disgrace was no secret. Her provincial upbringing was the subject of countless whispers. Still, she raised her chin and answered softly, "It is a world of beauty and refinement. I feel its weight, but also its splendor." A murmur of amusement rippled among the ladies. One leaned to another and whispered too loudly, "Poor thing, she mistakes splendor for kindness." Laughter followed, thinly veiled behind fans. Beatrice's eyes gleamed. "Yes, splendor can be overwhelming," she said, "and one must learn quickly, for society here is not forgiving. We all must master its rules, or be crushed by them." She sipped her wine, her gaze fixed upon Lydia. "But I suppose you already know something of that." The words struck with precision, and Lydia's heart tightened. She forced a small smile, but her eyes burned with humiliation. She remembered her mother's plea, Endure, endure for the sake of their name. She swallowed her pride, though it seared her throat. As the afternoon waned, Beatrice delivered her final blow. Rising gracefully from the table, she approached Lydia with the smile of a predator. "You must understand, my dear," she said in a low voice, audible only to her. "Victor Caldwell does not marry for affection. He marries for necessity. Do not deceive yourself into thinking he will ever truly accept you." Lydia's breath caught. The cruelty of the words struck deeper than all the laughter, deeper than all the whispers. For an instant, despair threatened to overwhelm her, yet as she met Beatrice's gaze, she glimpsed something beneath the malice, jealousy, sharp and unrelenting. The realization gave her a spark of strength. That evening, back within the marble halls of her new home, Lydia wandered through the gallery where portraits of unknown Caldwells stared down from their gilded frames. She paused before a mirror, her reflection blurred by the glow of lamplight. The young woman who gazed back at her was no longer simply Lydia Montrose. She bore the name of Caldwell, and with it the burden of pride and defiance. Victor appeared in the doorway, his presence filling the silence. His eyes lingered upon her, unreadable as ever. For a moment, Lydia longed to tell him of the cruelty she had endured, of the venom that Beatrice had whispered into her ear. Yet her lips remained sealed. To confess would be to admit weakness, and weakness was a luxury she could not afford. Instead, she offered him a steady look, her voice calm, though her heart trembled. "Newport society has sharp edges, Victor. I shall learn to walk among them without bleeding." He regarded her with a flicker of something she could not name, respect perhaps or surprise. But he said nothing, only inclined his head and turned away. Lydia's chest tightened with unspoken longing. If he could see her strength, if he could recognize her courage, perhaps she might one day earn more than his protection. That night, alone in her chamber, Lydia lay awake as moonlight traced silver patterns across the floor. The whispers of society still rang in her ears, cruel and relentless, yet within her stirred a new resolve. She would not be crushed by their scorn. She would not bow to Beatrice Langley's malice. She would endure, with dignity if not with joy, until she discovered the hidden path that fate had set before her. And as the waves of Newport crashed against the cliffs beyond the mansion walls, Lydia vowed silently to herself she would not be an ornament, nor a pawn. She would find her place in this gilded prison, and she would learn its rules not as a victim, but as a survivor. The days that followed Lydia's first luncheon among Newport society moved with the slow weight of an unfamiliar tide. She had entered her new life as though stepping into a gilded cage, one she feared would suffocate her, yet she began to sense that not every bar was as unyielding as it seemed. Victor Caldwell remained a man of formidable silence, his presence commanding yet distant. Still, in fleeting moments, the mask he wore cracked, and in those cracks Lydia glimpsed something that stirred both suspicion and an ache of tenderness she dared not name. It was at a soirée one evening, in a ballroom blazing with 1,000 lights, that she first noticed the shift. The mansion belonged to one of Victor's associates, a railroad baron whose fortune rivaled his own. The air shimmered with perfume, the swish of satin gowns, the laughter of women glittering with diamonds. Lydia stood alone near the gilded columns, her gloved hands clasped together, when she overheard two matrons whispering behind their fans. "She was bartered like merchandise," one said with a laugh sharp as glass. "The Montrose girl," the other replied. "Victor's charity case. He might as well have bought her at auction." The words struck Lydia with a force that threatened to undo her fragile composure. Her cheeks flamed, and she turned her face away, determined not to let them see the tears pricking at her eyes. But then Victor appeared at her side, tall and immovable, his dark gaze sweeping the women into silence. He did not speak, but his presence alone silenced their whispers. Without a word, he offered Lydia his arm, and though his expression remained unreadable, She felt a strange protection emanating from him, as if he had stepped into the storm for her sake. Later that evening, while music filled the air and couples swirled across the polished floor, Lydia and Victor lingered at the edge of the terrace. The night carried the scent of roses and salt from the sea, the distant waves beating against the cliffs in steady rhythm. Lydia drew her shawl closer around her shoulders, the cool breeze lifting strands of her chestnut hair. "You should not let their words wound you," Victor said, his tone low, his eyes fixed on the dark horizon. Lydia glanced at him, surprised by the softness in his voice. "They wound because they are true, or nearly so," she whispered. "I was sold to you, Victor. Society will never let me forget it." He turned toward her then, his eyes shadowed but intense. "You are my wife," he said firmly. "No one has the right to reduce you to anything less. If they do, they will answer to me." The fire in his words startled her. For the first time, she saw not only the steel magnate feared in boardrooms, but a man who claimed her as his own with a force that stirred her pulse. She lowered her gaze, her heart beating fast, and the silence between them grew charged, heavy with emotions neither could name. The days continued, and small moments revealed cracks in Victor's formidable mask. At a tea held by one of Newport's more benevolent hostesses, Lydia found herself cornered by Beatrice Langley. Beatrice's smile was a blade wrapped in silk. "My dear," she murmured, her voice carrying easily to the ladies nearby, "you play the part of mistress of Caldwell's mansion quite well. Yet how fragile a part it is, when one considers that your family was ruined and that you are little more than the memory of a debt paid." The insult stung, yet before Lydia could falter, words leapt to her lips. "It is curious," she said, her tone calm but steady, "that you should be so interested in my place here. Perhaps it is because you wish it were your own." The ladies gasped softly, fans fluttering like startled birds. Beatrice's smile stiffened, her eyes flashing with fury. And at that moment, Lydia caught sight of Victor across the room, watching her. For the briefest instant, his lips curved, an expression so rare and fleeting it might have been imagined. A smile, small yet undeniable, that filled Lydia with a warmth she had not thought possible in his presence. But the warmth was not without shadows. One evening, while Victor was away attending to business, Lydia wandered the halls of the mansion, her steps echoing against the marble floors. The house was immense, a labyrinth of silence and secrets. She entered his study, a room panelled in dark wood, lined with shelves of books and ledgers, its air heavy with the scent of ink and old paper. Upon the massive desk lay a box of polished oak, locked with a simple clasp. Curiosity stirred within her, a temptation she struggled to resist. Yet her fingers, trembling, sought the key that rested nearby. She opened the box slowly, the hinges creaking in protest. Inside lay letters bound with a faded ribbon. The handwriting was delicate, unmistakably feminine. Lydia's heart quickened as she lifted one sheet, the ink faded yet legible. Words of endearment, phrases of longing, written not by her hand but by another, a woman whose presence still lingered in the very heart of the house. His first wife. She read no more than a line before guilt overcame her. She replaced the letters quickly, her breath shallow, her hands trembling as she closed the box. Yet the discovery seared itself into her mind. The shadow of the late Mrs. Caldwell remained within these walls, and Lydia could not escape the feeling that she was measured against a memory she would never equal. That night, alone in her chamber, Lydia could not sleep. The firelight flickered against the walls, and her thoughts returned again and again to Victor. She remembered his rare smile, the force of his defense, the intensity of his gaze when he promised she would not be humiliated. And yet she also remembered the letters, hidden away like sacred relics of a love that had once been his, perhaps a love that had been betrayed, or perhaps one he still mourned. Confusion gripped her. She felt herself drawn toward him, compelled by glimpses of warmth that hinted at the man he might be beneath his armor. At the same time, Suspicion coiled within her heart, warning her that his past remained an untouchable mystery, a wound that might never heal. The mansion, gilded and vast, seemed to echo with both possibility and peril. Every glance from Victor left her trembling, every silence stretched taut with unspoken meaning. Lydia lay in her bed, her hand pressed to her heart, wondering if what she felt was fear, compassion, or something far more dangerous. And as the night deepened, Lydia realized that she no longer knew where the mask ended and the man began. The cracks revealed glimpses of light, yet also shadows. Her fate, bound to his, grew heavier with each passing day, for she could not decide if she was walking toward salvation or ruin. The summer sun had barely set when Newport's grandest ball of the season began, and yet the air outside the gilded mansion already hummed with expectation. Carriages rattled along Bellevue Avenue, their lanterns glowing like fireflies in the dusk, carrying ladies in silken gowns and gentlemen polished as marble statues. The night promised opulence, but within the glittering anticipation lurked a darker current, for a scandal had taken root in Newport's soil and spread like wildfire across parlours and drawing rooms. The rumour was cruel in its simplicity. Lydia Caldwell, daughter of a disgraced family, had been sold to Victor as one might purchase a courtesan. The words were poisonous, whispered behind fans and carried in coded laughter until no corner of society remained untouched. Lydia had sensed the shift even before the ball, in the cool smiles of acquaintances, in the sudden hush that followed her entrance into shops or carriage rides along the avenue. But it was tonight, beneath the brilliance of chandeliers, that the weight of scandal would descend upon her fully. She stood in her chamber as her maid fastened the final pearl clasp of her evening gown, her hands trembling despite her will. The gown was of pale rose silk, its train embroidered with silver thread, its bodice adorned with lace that shimmered under the lamplight. A delicate diamond pendant, a gift from Victor's coffers but not his heart, rested at her throat. She gazed at her reflection in the mirror, a young woman poised like a portrait, yet beneath the satin and jewels beat a heart raw with dread. Victor entered then, dressed in formal black, his coat perfectly cut, his presence filling the room with the same commanding weight it carried in boardrooms and ballrooms alike. His eyes, dark and unreadable, swept over her. He gave no compliment, no word of reassurance, yet he extended his arm. Lydia placed her hand upon it, her glove trembling against his sleeve, and together they descended the staircase. The ball was already in full splendor when they arrived. The grand hall shone with 1,000 lights, chandeliers sparkling like constellations brought down from the heavens. Music rose in a waltz, the violins soaring, the cellos resonant, while gowns of emerald, sapphire, and ivory swirled across the polished floor. The scent of roses mingled with perfume, with the tang of champagne and candle smoke. But as Lydia entered on Victor's arm, the music faltered, not by design, but by the subtle hesitation of musicians distracted by the ripple of whispers that swept the room. Heads turned, fans froze mid-motion, conversations cut short. The rumour had preceded her, and now it was alive in the hush that descended like a suffocating veil. "Sold to him," a voice murmured, just loud enough for her ears. "Nothing more than a purchase," another replied, followed by the rustle of silk and the hiss of laughter behind gloved hands. Lydia's cheeks burned crimson. She felt the heat rise to her temples, her breath catching in her throat. Every step through that glittering crowd was an ordeal, each glance a dagger. Her hands tightened against Victor's arm, though she dared not look up at him. She feared the confirmation of her humiliation in his eyes. They reached the head of the ballroom, where the host greeted them with exaggerated courtesy, his smile too broad, his bow too low. The falseness of it stung worse than any insult. Lydia's pulse thundered in her ears as she curtsied, her knees weak beneath the weight of every gaze. The night wore on with cruelty disguised as elegance. Women brushed past her with saccharine smiles, murmuring greetings that dripped with hidden venom. How fortunate you are, my dear, to have caught the attention of such a powerful man. Their words were daggers concealed in velvet, slicing deep, though their tones remained sweet. Gentlemen nodded with stiff civility, but she caught their smirks when they turned away. She felt herself drowning, her dignity slipping with every whispered word. It was during a pause in the dancing that the humiliation reached its height. Lydia had just stepped aside to sip water from a crystal glass when Beatrice Langley, radiant in crimson silk, approached with her retinue. Her smile was triumphant, her eyes alight with malice. "My dear Mrs. Caldwell," Beatrice purred, her voice pitched to carry across the nearest circle of listeners. "I do hope you're enjoying your evening. One hears such dreadful things, but surely you rise above them, yes? After all, a lady must endure when her place is, how shall we say, arranged." The laughter that followed was not loud, but it was sharp enough to pierce Lydia's composure. Her hand trembled, her glass shaking in its stem. For a moment, despair threatened to claim her, the desire to flee almost overpowering. She lifted her eyes, only to find Victor's gaze upon her, steady, dark, and unreadable as ever. Then, to her astonishment, he stepped forward. His voice, low but commanding, carried across the ballroom like a thunderclap. "Enough." The word silenced the room. Conversations died mid-sentence, fans stilled, music faltered. All eyes turned upon Victor, who stood tall beside his wife, his presence undeniable, his authority absolute. He fixed his gaze upon Beatrice, and though his tone remained calm, it carried a weight that brooked no defiance. "Mrs. Caldwell is my wife. She stands beneath my protection, and I will not tolerate slander whispered or spoken against her. Those who choose to insult her insult me. And I assure you that is a mistake none here should wish to make." The silence that followed was absolute. Beatrice's smile faltered, her cheeks flushing with humiliation as she lowered her eyes. Around the room, glances shifted uneasily. The power of Victor Caldwell's name, feared in finance and now declared in defense of his wife, hung heavy in the air. Lydia's breath caught, her chest tightening with a rush of emotions she could not contain. She had expected his silence, his indifference. Instead, he had defended her publicly, shattering the mask of reserve that he wore so carefully. For the first time, she felt the stirrings of a bond between them, a fragile thread woven not of duty, but of protection, of recognition. The music resumed, hesitant at first, then flowing once more. Conversations picked up, forced and uneasy. The scandal had not died, but it had been silenced for the night. Lydia remained at Victor's side, her hand still upon his arm, her heart trembling with confusion. When the ball concluded and they returned to the carriage, Lydia sat in silence, her eyes lowered, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Victor said nothing, his profile carved in shadows against the lantern light. Yet she could still hear his words ringing in her ears, fierce and unyielding. "She is my wife." Back at the mansion, as she ascended the staircase with her gown trailing softly behind her, Lydia realized that fear was no longer the only force that bound her to him. Something else had begun to take root, fragile and dangerous. It was not trust, not yet, but it was the first spark of something that might become more. And as she lay awake that night, the whispers of scandal still clinging to her memory, she pressed her hand to her heart and wondered if Victor Caldwell's defense was a fleeting moment of duty or the beginning of something neither of them had foreseen. The mansion lay cloaked in silence that evening, as though even its marble walls anticipated the weight of revelation. A storm brewed outside, the kind that swept in from the Atlantic without warning, its winds rattling shutters and carrying the scent of brine through the corridors. Lydia sat in the drawing room, her gown of ivory silk gleaming faintly under the dim glow of a single lamp. She had tried to read, to distract her restless mind with the printed words of a novel, but the letters blurred before her eyes. The memory of the ball, of Victor's unexpected defense, lingered still, entwined with the cruel whispers of scandal. Victor entered quietly, his presence filling the space with its usual command. He was without his coat, his black waistcoat unbuttoned at the top, his hair slightly disheveled, as if he had raked a hand through it one too many times. He seemed different tonight, not merely the stern magnate, but a man carrying a burden he could no longer contain. His gaze rested on Lydia, and for once she did not lower her eyes. "You wonder about me," he said, his voice deep but unsteady, as though the admission itself cost him dearly. "You wonder about her." Lydia's breath caught. She knew without asking that he spoke of his first wife, the figure whose shadow lingered in every corridor, whose name was etched into society's collective memory, though Lydia herself had never dared speak it aloud. She set aside the book and folded her hands in her lap, her heart pounding. "I have heard whispers," she replied softly, "but I do not know the truth." Victor crossed the room, each step deliberate, his boots sounding against the polished floor. He stopped near the mantelpiece, his hand resting upon its edge as though he needed the support. The fire cast a glow across his face, accentuating the hard planes of his jaw, the tension that tightened his features. "She was everything society adores," he began, his voice heavy with bitterness. "Beautiful, gracious, admired by all. They called her perfect, the jewel of every gathering. And perhaps she was, for them, but not for me." Lydia's chest tightened. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes fixed on him, afraid to breathe too loudly lest she shatter the fragile courage with which he spoke. "She betrayed me," he continued, his tone rough, as though dragged from a wound that had never closed. "Not once, not twice. She gave her smiles, her laughter, her very tenderness to another man while she bore my name. And all the while society praised her as though she were a saint." The words fell like stones, each one striking with painful clarity. Lydia pressed her hand to her mouth, her heart aching with the force of his confession. She had never imagined such darkness hidden behind the silence he wore so carefully. "Then came the night she died," Victor said, his gaze distant, fixed on memories no firelight could banish. "An accident," they said, "a fall from the cliffs. Some claimed it was despair, others whispered it was punishment. I buried her, but I did not bury the whispers. They followed me, they follow me still. To society, I am the man whose wife died tragically, the man they pity and fear in equal measure. To myself, I am the man who trusted once and was destroyed for it." His voice broke on the last word, not in sound, but in the weight behind it. Lydia's eyes filled with tears she could not suppress. She rose, moving toward him slowly, as if any sudden motion might drive him back into silence. She stopped, just a breath away, her fingers trembling at her side, aching to reach for him, but restrained by the invisible walls he still held between them. "Victor," she whispered, her voice breaking with compassion. "You have carried this alone." He turned to her then, his eyes dark and unyielding, yet within them flickered something raw. Pain, yes, but also the faintest spark of need. "Alone is the only way I know," he said. "I told myself I would never allow another woman near enough to wound me again. And yet," he faltered, his gaze dropping briefly before finding hers again, "and yet you are here." The tension between them quivered, fragile and undeniable. Lydia felt the storm both within and without pressing against her. She wanted to ease his suffering, to tell him he was not alone anymore. Yet even as compassion welled within her, insecurity twisted in her chest. How could she, Lydia Montrose, disgraced daughter of a fallen family, ever hope to compete with the memory of the woman society still praised as perfect? "You speak of betrayal," she said softly, her hands clasped tightly before her to hide their trembling. "But all the world remembers her as flawless. How am I, with my family's disgrace and my own inexperience, to stand against such a shadow? Will I, too, always be measured by what they see and what they whisper?" Victor's eyes darkened. He stepped closer, the distance between them reduced to a breath. "I do not measure you against her," he said, his tone sharp, almost fierce. "Do not think I do. You are not her. You could never be her, and that is why—" He stopped, as though the words burned too hot to finish. Lydia's heart thundered. The nearness of him, the intensity of his gaze, made her tremble with emotions too vast to contain. She felt the air between them alive with tension, a current that bound them, though neither dared reach for the other. Her tears spilled then, unbidden, glistening against her cheeks. Victor lifted a hand, hesitating as if the motion required a battle within himself. At last, he brushed the back of his fingers gently against her cheek, a touch so fleeting it might have been a dream. The contact set her heart alight, not with passion alone, but with the profound tenderness of a man who had allowed himself a moment of vulnerability. "Do not fear shadows," he murmured. "They belong to the past. You are of the present, and for that I cannot ignore you." The words, though restrained, resonated within Lydia like a vow. She closed her eyes briefly, savoring the sensation of his hand against her face, the warmth of his presence. For that moment, the mansion no longer felt like a prison, but a place where two wounded souls might one day find solace. Yet as the fire crackled and the storm raged beyond the windows, doubt still lingered within her. Society's whispers were relentless, and the memory of his late wife loomed large. Could she, Lydia, ever step fully from the shadow of the past? Or would she forever live in its cold embrace, loved perhaps, but never wholly free? Victor's hand fell away, the mask sliding back into place, though his eyes lingered on her with an intensity she would not soon forget. He turned toward the fire, his silhouette outlined by its glow, leaving Lydia standing in silence, her heart both heavy and alight. The storm outside broke then, rain lashing against the windows, thunder rolling across the sky. Inside, the storm remained unspoken, woven between them in glances, in silences, in words half-uttered and left unfinished. Lydia sank into a chair, her hands pressed to her chest, as the truth of his confession settled deep within her soul. She had come to fear him once, to despise the bargain that had bound her to his name. Now she saw him differently, not as a monster, but as a man scarred by betrayal, condemned by rumor, and haunted by a love turned into a lie. Her sympathy deepened into something perilous, something she could not yet name, but which stirred with every glance, every breath, every fleeting touch. The night stretched long, filled with the rhythm of rain against glass and the crackle of flames. Lydia sat awake long after Victor had retreated into silence, her heart torn between fear of the past and the dangerous hope that perhaps, just perhaps, the future might hold something more than shadows. The sky over Newport had turned a pale grey by mid-morning, heavy with the promise of autumn rain. A quiet stillness clung to the mansion, broken only by the soft rhythm of servants' footsteps and the occasional whisper behind closed doors. Lydia wandered the corridor outside the library, her fingers trailing along the carved wainscoting, her thoughts tangled in the memory of Victor's confession. Since that storm-drenched evening, something fragile had begun to form between them, not yet named, but undeniably present. A glance held a moment too long, a silence that no longer felt hostile but hesitant, and at times almost intimate. She had begun to hope. It was that hope that made what came next all the more devastating. Beatrice Langley had grown quiet in the days that followed the scandal at the ball, but her silence was no surrender. The humiliation she had suffered had only deepened her resolve. Watching Lydia rise, unshattered by Victor's side, had kindled something bitter and burning in her chest. She could not allow such a victory. Not from the daughter of a disgraced family, not from the girl who had taken the place Beatrice had once imagined for herself. And so, with a grace sharpened by spite, she reached out to one of Victor's oldest rivals, Everett Lockridge, a man whose smile never reached his eyes and whose fortune had withered in Victor's shadow. Their shared hatred birthed a scheme as elegant as it was cruel. It began with a letter, folded in cream-colored stationery, sealed with a Montrose family crest, and placed discreetly among Victor's morning correspondence. It arrived as if by accident, though there were no accidents in such circles. Lydia knew nothing of it when Victor entered the study that morning, the envelope already opened, his fingers clenched around the page. His eyes did not seek her at first. He stood at the window, the rain casting silver lines across the glass, the letter dangling from his hand like a blade he had yet to use. Lydia entered quietly, dressed in a gown of dove grey and lilac, her expression soft as she crossed the room, unaware of the storm waiting beneath his stillness. "Victor?" she asked gently. "You've not come to breakfast." He turned slowly. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were colder than she had known them in weeks. "Tell me," he said, voice tight, "how long had the plan been in place?" Lydia blinked, confusion knitting her brow. "What plan?" He approached, the letter held between two fingers. "To trap me. To marry for fortune under the veil of ruin. Was it your idea? Or did your mother orchestrate the whole thing?" The room tilted beneath her feet. "What are you saying?" Victor's tone sharpened, each word falling like glass on stone. "I received a letter written by your father, or so it seems, boasting of your success, a clear record of your family's intentions, that you would charm me, win me, and restore the Montrose name with my wealth." Lydia reached for the letter, but he pulled it away. Her eyes, wide with disbelief, searched his face. "You believe this?" His jaw clenched. "I don't know what to believe. I trusted once. I was betrayed." The blow landed deep, far deeper than any whisper from society or cruelty from Beatrice. It was not the accusation itself that shattered Lydia, but the fact that it came from him, after everything. After the truth he had entrusted to her, after the moment of nearness that had passed between them. "I have never lied to you," she said, her voice trembling. "Not once. I came here unwillingly, yes, but I never deceived you. Not about who I am, not about what I've endured." Victor looked away, the muscle in his jaw twitching. "And yet here it is, written, clear as day." She moved toward him then, her voice rising not in anger, but in heartbreak. "You carry your wounds like shields, Victor. I understand that now. But if you cannot see the difference between the woman who betrayed you and the one who has stood beside you in silence, then perhaps you will never see anything at all." The silence that followed was worse than shouting. Victor did not respond. He merely set the letter down on the desk and turned his back to her, as though the weight of his doubt had already made its judgment. Lydia stood for a moment longer, waiting, hoping for a word, a glance, anything, but none came. And so she left the room without another sound, her gown brushing the doorway like the final note of a requiem. That afternoon, the mansion felt colder. The servants spoke in hushed voices, sensing the shift in air. Lydia locked herself in the music room, her hands resting on the keys of the grand piano, though no melody came. Her fingers would not move, her heart would not speak. What had bloomed between them had not been love, not yet, but it had been the beginning of something rare, something earned in glances, in truths shared behind closed doors. And now it was fractured, reduced to silence by a lie. She remembered the forged letter, the way Victor had refused to look at her when she pleaded for trust. And she felt, more than ever, the cage of their marriage, no longer gilded, but cold and sharp. By evening, the rain had ceased, leaving behind only grey skies and a garden soaked in silence. Lydia walked alone along the stone path near the rose beds, her skirts damp at the hem, her thoughts unravelling like thread. She did not cry, she could not. The pain sat too deep for tears. Instead, she let the chill air fill her lungs, the sharp scent of wet earth grounding her. Somewhere distant and unseen, a bird sang, a high, wavering note that reminded her the world moved on, even when hearts did not. She no longer knew what place she held in Victor's life. She no longer knew whether trust was a bridge they could ever rebuild. All she knew was that she had spoken the truth, and it had not been enough. And as the mansion loomed behind her, beautiful and vast, Lydia wondered whether it had ever been hers at all, or if she had simply wandered its halls as a ghost, mistaken for something she could never be. Night fell without ceremony, and within its darkness, Lydia made no promises, no vows, only silence, only endurance. For in a world of forged letters and shattered faith, love, if it ever came, would have to be born not from grand gestures, but from the quiet, steady battle of surviving betrayal without becoming bitter. And in that, Lydia Montrose Caldwell would remain unbroken, even if her heart bore the wound of mistrust, even if the man she had begun to feel for had turned away. Even then, the evening air in Newport clung to the skin like silk, warm and thick with the scent of autumn roses and polished wood. Gas lamps flickered along Bellevue Avenue, casting golden light over carriages as they lined up before the Delacroix estate, the setting of the last grand gala of the season. It was a night meant for elegance, for whispered proposals and glittering gowns, for laughter layered over ambition. But for Lydia Caldwell, it was the night her silence would end. She stood alone before the mirror in her dressing chamber, her reflection trembling ever so slightly in the flickering candlelight. Her gown was unlike the pastels she usually wore. Tonight she had chosen midnight blue, edged in silver thread, the fabric flowing like water and cinched at the waist with quiet authority. Her hair was swept into a graceful crown of braids, pinned with tiny sapphire combs that caught the light when she turned. Her maid had hesitated when presenting the dress. "It is very bold, ma'am." "Yes," Lydia had answered, her voice steady. "That's precisely the point." Downstairs the carriage waited. Victor had already departed earlier for the gala, citing business with the host. No invitation had been extended to her, not formally. And yet, her presence tonight was not a matter of protocol. It was a necessity. In her gloved hand, she held the very letter that had nearly destroyed her. Folded and pressed flat, its edges worn from the hours she had stared at it, memorizing each forged line. It bore her father's name and crest, and yet she knew, with a certainty rooted deep in instinct, that it was not written by his hand. The signature inked at the bottom had once been familiar to her, flowing, practiced, but the message it carried was poison. She could not rest until it was burned before the eyes of those who had believed it. The Delacroix estate rose ahead, ablaze with light. Every window glowed, and the sound of strings and laughter spilled into the night. The butler, startled by her unannounced arrival, hesitated before offering a shallow bow. "Announce me, please," Lydia said, her chin lifted. "Mrs. Caldwell, I was not informed. You are informed now." Her tone left no room for question. The man blinked, bowed again, and obeyed. The ballroom fell into a soft hush as her name was called. Heads turned, fans lowered, eyes widened. She stepped into the room with measured grace, the train of her gown gliding across the marble floor like a tide. Gaslight shimmered against her jewels, but it was not the diamonds that commanded attention, it was her bearing. Victor turned slowly from his conversation with the senator, his expression unreadable at first, then tightening as he registered her presence and what it meant. She met his gaze without flinching. She did not walk to him, not yet. She walked to the center of the ballroom where the musicians hesitated, uncertain whether to continue. Then she turned to face the crowd. Newport's elite, the same who had whispered behind fans, who had smiled with daggers in their eyes. "I have something to say," she began, her voice clear and unwavering, "and I will not leave this room until every one of you has heard it." A wave of discomfort swept through the guests. Beatrice Langley, standing near the buffet, raised a glass to her lips with forced nonchalance. Lydia unfolded the letter slowly, letting its presence speak before her words did. "This letter," she said, holding it aloft, "was planted among my husband's correspondence. It claims to be written by my father. In it, there are words that speak of schemes and manipulation, that I was sent to entrap Mr. Caldwell for wealth and social redemption." Gasps echoed around the ballroom. Several fans snapped open in synchronized shock. Victor's eyes never left her. "But this letter," Lydia continued, her voice growing firmer, "is a lie. A forgery, and I will tell you why. She walked slowly across the ballroom, past the clusters of guests, until she stood before Everett Lockridge. The steel magnate paled as her eyes met his. "This letter bears the Montrose crest," she said, "but the paper itself? This particular stock is used only in personal correspondence ordered by the Lockridge Company." I recognized the watermark. All heads turned. Everett faltered, his expression cracking. Lydia turned next to Beatrice, whose painted smile had begun to falter beneath the weight of truth. "You wanted to ruin me, Mrs. Langley, but I was never yours to break. You forged a story and planted it with my husband to destroy a marriage you never believed in." Beatrice laughed too sharply. "What a charming tale." Lydia stepped closer. "You've wanted his attention for years, and when you saw him protect me at the gala, you knew you had lost. So you twisted the very thing that made us vulnerable. His past, his pain." She turned now to Victor. His face was carved from shadow and silence. The letter trembled in her fingers. "I cannot force you to believe me," she said, her voice softer now. "But I can stand before all of Newport and declare that I have never lied to you, not once. If you choose to believe in this lie, then let it be your shame, not mine." She placed the letter on a silver tray and struck a match. The flame danced, then devoured the page. Smoke curled into the air, curling through the room like a ghost being exorcised. The silence that followed was thick, almost holy. Then Victor stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. His eyes locked on Lydia's, and the crowd seemed to blur around them. "You never lied to me," he said, the words low, heavy with emotion. "But I lied to myself." A murmur rose through the crowd, but he silenced it with a glance. He reached for her hand, and for the first time did not hesitate to touch her in public, not as a duty, but as a man reaching for what he feared he had already lost. "I believed the lie because it was easier than believing I might care," he said, his voice rough. "I let ghosts blind me to the truth that stood before me, and I see now that I nearly destroyed the only thing in my life not built of steel and pride." Lydia's breath caught, tears rising fast and hot behind her eyes. Victor turned to the room, his voice gaining strength. "My wife has more courage than any man in this hall, and I will not stand by while her name is used for sport or revenge. Those who speak her name from this night forward will do so with respect, or not at all." For a moment no one moved. Then the host bowed. Others followed. Beatrice Langley, her face pale and rigid, turned away without a word. Victor turned back to Lydia. "If you will allow it, I would begin again. Not as a man who owns your name, but one who begs to be worthy of it." Lydia's lips trembled. She nodded only once, and in that nod the chains that had bound them, pride, pain, betrayal, began to fall away. They did not embrace, they did not kiss, but the space between them disappeared, and for the first time since the day she entered his home, Lydia Caldwell no longer walked alone. She walked beside him, as his partner, as his equal, and as they exited the ballroom together, her hand resting firmly in his, society watched, not with scorn, but with awe. For it was not scandal that had triumphed that night. It was truth. It was courage. It was the quiet, undeniable breaking of every chain that had once held her captive. A golden hush fell over Newport as the last gala of the season faded into memory. The leaves along Bellevue Avenue had begun to turn, brushed with amber and russet, as if the very trees had grown weary of summer's extravagance and were retreating into something quieter, more honest. The town's grand mansions stood with dignified silence, their windows no longer aglow with nightly receptions, but rather lit by a softer, more domestic light. At Caldwell House, something had changed. The stillness was no longer cold, the silence no longer weighed down the air. There was a kind of peace that lingered in the corridors, not loud or boastful, but born of two hearts that had finally laid down their weapons. It had been 4 days since the gala, and the world had not ended. On the contrary, it had realigned. Beatrice Langley had withdrawn from society under the guise of an extended trip to Paris. Everett Lockridge's name was now spoken with caution, and Victor Caldwell's once feared reputation had taken on a new shape, still powerful, still respected, but no longer untouchable. And Lydia, the girl once sold into a marriage of necessity, now walked the halls of her husband's mansion with the quiet assurance of a woman who had earned every step. She stood in the music room that morning, sunlight flooding through tall windows, her hands gliding softly over the ivory keys of the piano. Not a song, just sound rising and falling like breath. Her eyes were half closed, her thoughts far from the notes. She heard him before she saw him. Victor never announced himself. His presence always filled the room first. He stood at the doorway, watching her with a softness that had once been hidden behind steel and silence. "You're playing again," he said. Lydia lifted her hands from the keys and turned slowly. "Only today." "Why today?" "Because it feels like I can." A pause. "Then may I sit with you?" She nodded. He crossed the room without haste, and when he sat beside her on the velvet bench, their shoulders brushed. It was the smallest of touches, yet it stirred something deep within her. The memory of that night, of firelight and rain, of pain shared and truth unveiled, still lived between them, not as a wound, but as a bridge. He said nothing for a long time. Then he spoke. Not with the clipped tone of the businessman, nor the resigned voice of the widower, but with something new, something uncertain and unguarded. "I've spent my life building things no one could tear down," he said. "I built empires, walls, a name that men feared to challenge, but it gave me nothing that mattered, until you." Lydia's heart pounded. She turned toward him, her breath caught. Victor's eyes met hers, steady but filled with unspoken ache. "What we began with was not fair to you. I didn't see you, not really. I saw what you threatened to become, another betrayal, another wound, and I hardened myself before I ever gave you the chance to prove otherwise." Her voice was soft, barely a whisper. "And now?" His hand reached for hers, not commanded, not claimed, simply offered. His fingers closed gently around hers, warm and sure. "Now I see you," he said. "And I want you, not out of obligation or need, but because somewhere in the quiet between your strength and your dignity, you reached me." She didn't answer with words. She simply let her hand remain in his, their silence more eloquent than any vow. That afternoon, a few of Victor's associates arrived for a brief meeting in the drawing room. Lydia had not planned to be present, she rarely was. But as the men gathered, voices low and clipped, she stepped into the room with calm poise and a gaze that did not waver. The men rose out of habit. One of them, a portly gentleman with grey whiskers and a monocle, cleared his throat awkwardly. "Mrs. Caldwell, we were unaware." "She is here because she is my wife," Victor said, his voice firm but not sharp. "And anything said in my presence may be said in hers. From this day forward, that will never be in question." The words hung in the air. Not boastful, not dramatic, just final. Lydia felt the eyes on her, but for once they did not sting, they did not judge, they merely looked, and then looked away. Later that evening the sky turned silver above the ocean. The wind came cool off the water, lifting the scent of salt and drying leaves into the air. Victor had a supper prepared, not in the great dining hall, but on the seaside terrace behind the house, a place Lydia had only ever visited alone. The table was small, draped in white linen, adorned with delicate lanterns that swayed in the breeze. The view looked out over the cliffs, where waves crashed against the rocks with the rhythm of something ancient and unchanging. Lydia stepped onto the terrace slowly, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders. The wind tugged gently at the edges of her gown, and her hair danced at her temples. Victor stood as she approached, his face lit by the lanterns. He pulled out her chair with care, and once seated poured her a glass of wine without a word. They ate simply, bread, roasted vegetables, a tender fish in lemon and herbs, but every motion, every silence was thick with unspoken emotion. When they had finished, Lydia rose and walked to the edge of the terrace. Below, the sea roared softly, and the stars had begun to emerge, one by one, like tiny fires rekindled. Victor joined her. He didn't speak for several moments. Then he said quietly, "You were sold to me." Her breath caught. He turned toward her. "That is how it began. Let us not lie to ourselves about it. I purchased the preservation of your family's name. I accepted the terms as a matter of convenience, of self-protection. But tonight, I give you back your freedom." She looked up at him, confused. He reached into his coat and produced a document, folded and sealed. He handed it to her. "This annuls the binding clause of our marriage contract, the one that secured your family's debts through this union. It will be paid regardless. You are no longer bound to me by obligation, Lydia." Her hands shook as she held the parchment. "You wish to release me?" "I wish to give you a choice," he said. "To love me of your own will, or to leave if what we've become is not enough." She stared at him, the sea crashing behind them, her heart splitting open with too many emotions to name. And then she did something that startled even herself. She tore the document in half. "No," she whispered. "I was not yours by choice, but I remain now because I wish to. Because somewhere between your silence and my pride, I found something I never expected to want. Your heart." Victor stepped forward, his hands cupping her face, but not pulling her to him, simply holding her as though she were something fragile and precious. "I am still learning how to give it," he said. She smiled through tears. "Then let us learn together." And there, on the terrace above the sea, Lydia rose not as a girl bartered for her family's survival, but as a woman chosen, cherished, and whole. The waves sang below them, crashing in triumph. The stars burned above, and in that moment, the past no longer held them. Only the future did. Together. Newport, summer of 1893. The sea still roared against the cliffs behind Caldwell House, but its voice had softened over the years, as if time itself had calmed its wildness. The great waves no longer sounded like warnings or cries of war. They whispered now, like memories carried in salt and foam. The house stood much the same, its marble facade untouched by age, its gardens carefully tended. But within its walls, everything had changed. A little boy ran through the rose garden barefoot, his laughter echoing across the hedges. His curls bounced with each step, and in his hands he clutched a wooden ship, carved from cedar and polished with care. Behind him, a young girl, no more than 6, chased after him with a ribbon trailing from her hand, her bonnet forgotten somewhere in the grass. Their voices reached the terrace, where Lydia sat beneath the striped awning, her embroidery forgotten in her lap. She watched them with a smile that belonged only to women who had once known silence and now cherished every sound. Her dark hair, now streaked with threads of silver, was pulled back in a simple twist. The years had touched her gently. Her gaze remained sharp, her poise unshaken, but there was a softness around her mouth that had not been there before. Victor emerged from the study with slower steps than a decade earlier, but with the same quiet power. His temples were grey now, his face more weathered, but his eyes had never been warmer. He walked to her side and set a hand on her shoulder. She covered it with her own. No words were needed. In the stillness between them, there was everything. The trials they had survived, the trust they had rebuilt, and the love that had endured, not in bursts of passion, but in 1,000 small choices made over the years. They had 2 children. A son, James Victor Caldwell, named after both strength and legacy, and a daughter, Eleanor Rose, named after no one, because she had come into the world blazing her own path. Their children would never know the weight of scandal, nor the cold gaze of a calculating society. Lydia had seen to that. The name Montrose had been quietly restored in New York, though Lydia rarely spoke of it. Her parents had passed in quiet dignity some years before, redeemed in part by the generosity of their daughter and the reputation she had earned, not by wealth, but by character. Beatrice Langley had never returned to Newport. After her self-imposed exile in Europe, she had attempted to reclaim her place in society, but something in her had hardened beyond repair. Whispers of her bitterness followed her, and eventually her name faded from invitations and ballrooms alike. Her beauty, once her weapon, had become a mask too heavy to wear. She had gambled everything on power and lost. Everett Lockridge's empire crumbled within 5 years. The scandal surrounding the forged letter had shaken investor confidence, and Victor, without needing to move a single finger, had watched the man's holdings fall like dominoes. When Lockridge died of a heart attack in his New York office, few mourned. Even fewer remembered him. As for society, it changed. Slowly, but it did. Newport's obsession with pedigree began to give way to admiration for quiet dignity, for marriages built on mutual respect rather than transactions. Lydia was never loud, never political, but her presence at every charitable board and school fundraiser, her willingness to receive newcomers with grace instead of suspicion, left a legacy more enduring than any family crest. One evening, on the same terrace where they had once stood at the edge of decision, Lydia and Victor sat side by side as the sun slipped into the ocean. Their children had been tucked into bed by their governess, and the house was wrapped in a hush deeper than silence. 10 years, Lydia murmured. Victor took her hand. I remember every one of them. She looked at him, her eyes still holding that same stormy blue. Do you regret how we began? He turned toward her, his voice quiet and sure. No, because it gave me the chance to become the man I never thought I could be. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and her voice caught with emotion, I became more than I was ever allowed to be. The waves crashed below, steady as breath. Above them stars blinked into view one by one. And there, in the deepening twilight, surrounded by the scent of roses and the echoes of laughter, Lydia Caldwell sat with the man who had once been her captor by circumstance and had become her partner by choice. The bargain that once bound them had long since been broken. What remained was love, stronger than scandal, deeper than pride, timeless and entirely their own. Sometimes love isn't born in candlelit gardens or whispered sonnets. It's forged in silence, misunderstanding, and the courage to choose one another again and again. Lydia and Victor's story reminds us that no beginning, no matter how painful, defines the ending. That redemption is real, that hearts, once guarded by pride or wounded by betrayal, can heal when we dare to listen, to trust, and to love without condition. Their journey, from a marriage of necessity to a union of souls, is a testament to the quiet strength of a woman who refused to be forgotten, and a man who chose to grow rather than remain broken. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who believes in second chances, or someone who needs to. You never know who might be moved by Lydia's strength, or by the possibility of turning duty into love. And if you made it all the way here, type C in the comments, so I'll know you stood with them until the very last wave. Don't forget to explore the other historical love stories waiting for you in the cards. Each one, like this, is a journey worth taking. Thank you for listening.